So our first question, what has been the inspiration behind Roots?
So Roots is my first poetry collection. It is really talking about the migratory journeys of my family and community across 3 continents over the last 150 years or so. The real inspiration behind the book is my grandparents, my Bapuji and Ba, who's here today, guest of honour. And it's really about their story. So my grandfather, who I call Bapuji, and Bapuji means father or grandfather, so you would expect it to come across in the book as like my Bapuji, but Bapuji was a man of such high sort of moral status that everyone in the community just called him Bapuji. Like, he was a father to so many people in that way. And so throughout the book and throughout the readings this evening, you'll hear him just referred to as Bapuji. And similarly, this is just Ba, not my Ba, just Ba. And so the book is really inspired by their journeys. My Bapuji was born in Kenya into the Indian diaspora there. And that diaspora originated because the British took Indians from Gujarat and other parts of India to work as indentured labourers on the railways in East Africa. So from his birth and from the very beginning, there is sort of a macro reason why he is in the place that he is. The next sort of really momentous part of his life is he went to India in the 40s to be a freedom fighter in the independence movement. And much later in his life, when he came to the UK, he was awarded an MBE by the Queen. And to me, there are all these sort of parts of his life that are determined by these colonial passions. And in some ways, there are these conflicts of interest that arise from these different experiences. You know, he went to India and he was shot in the leg whilst fighting for freedom by what was then the King's soldiers, and then came to the UK and was so proud to receive this accolade of the MBE. And to me, that is a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of identity, and was sort of one of the founding seeds of my thought as I went into this exploration of these migratory journeys in our community history, to explore that further. And I hope that as you guys read the book, you get a sense of some of that. But what I've really tried to do is marry the micro stories that I've heard growing up with the macro context that I've learned more about over the last sort of few years as I've tried to educate myself around that broader history.
Why do you think it's important to document family and community history?
So I think, I talked a lot about my grandfather's history, and I've been lucky enough to be brought up in the community that he was a big part of creating, and I've had the opportunity to learn a lot about my culture through engaging with that community, through my parents taking me on trips to India, through the food and the music, which has always been a big part of my life. But actually, a lot of my access to the history of India and our family has come from the education system. It's come from media that's not necessarily been created from within the community. So, learning about the British Raj from whitewashed curricula, or watching the big Gandhi film that came out in the 80s where Ben Kingsley is playing Gandhi. It makes absolutely no sense. Or reading Kipling and Thoreau's travels through the country. And to me, it's really important that there is a place made for our history as a community, because the reason that we are here today, in every way, shape or form, has been determined by actions and that have been made by the people in charge of this country. So I think there's definitely a gaping hole for the voices within this community to be talking and exploring their history. I think it's important for us to fill that hole while we can, while we have living memory, while we have people that are around to have these conversations and discussions with. And that became much clearer to me sort of over the pandemic, especially when coronavirus took the lives of several of our elders, both in care homes and sort of more broadly within their homes. And this idea of a whole generation of memories and histories disappearing at the same time is a bit of a wake-up call that we need to be engaging, we need to be documenting, and we need to be making space for this history in British literature, in British curricula. And so, I hope that maybe through engaging with this work, you'll also feel empowered to have some of those conversations amongst yourselves and your own families and communities, and demand space for them.
This is for the writers in the room. Can you talk about your process writing Roots?
So I think the real genesis for Roots, it's kind of been a very long-term project. When I would say around 2014, my grandfather asked me to help him write a book, and it was, the scope of the book at that point was he had written an autobiography and I was going to type it up for him. And we kind of went on this back and forth of trying to find the right way to tell his story, a way that elevated it away from just the micro details of his life. And so we tried this autobiographical form, we tried a series of sort of interview transcripts, and in the end I found that I was really struggling with a few things. One of these things was like not having the wider context in which to place his story and to give it the value that it deserved. And the second thing was, he was at an age where sometimes you'd ask him a question and you'd ask him the same question the next day and you'd get a different answer. Or some of the things he would say would be inconsistent with other things I knew about his life. And at the time I was studying physics and philosophy at university with some of my peers who have showed up today, which is lovely. But I was very scientific at that time, and to me it was a huge problem. If you're writing something historical, it should be factual, it should be accurate, and it put me off the project altogether. And so Roots in some ways is a reincarnation of that project in a completely different form, and in order to do justice to that problem, I've had to work it into the form, and I think that's part of the reason why I've moved towards poetry for this piece of work. I think that I've had the confidence to do that because I know that it was my grandfather's idea in the first place, that he wanted to put these stories out in the world. But I also think that I've realised that the history that is in the textbooks that we already have, that claims to be factual and accurate in this way, is also very one-dimensional, and the reality is that we each have different stories with the same experiences, and so this idea of having a singular narrative is what keeps those marginalised voices quiet. So I hope that with this book I'm not sure what the right word is, but embracing some of those inconsistencies, embracing the fact that our stories don't have to be linear, and I don't think we should be ashamed of that. There's a lot that's been lost, there's a lot that gets mistranslated, but even just putting something out there that you can back, that you can believe in, opens and sort of creates a foundation for a conversation.